The classroom was quiet, the last student having left an hour ago. Miss Elena sat at her desk with a stack of art projects, the late afternoon sun warming the papers. She enjoyed this part of the week, seeing the world through her students' eyes. One child's drawings always stood out. They were so vibrant, full of life and color. Pictures of a house with a big tree, a smiling sun, a family holding hands. At first glance, they were perfect, the kind of artwork you'd want to put on a refrigerator. But over several weeks, something changed. It was subtle at first. The same house appeared in every drawing, but now one window was always darkened, completely blacked out with a heavy layer of crayon. The family figures stood together, but one of them had developed cracks across their body, like a fractured statue. The changes were small, almost hidden beneath the cheerful colors. She felt a pull to look closer, that instinct teachers develop after years in the classroom, the feeling that something wasn't right, that this wasn't just artistic expression. It felt like a pattern, a quiet signal, repeated week after week. She decided she needed to make a phone call, to frame it as a routine check-in about the child's artistic development. She dialed the number from the student contact sheet, expecting a brief, pleasant conversation. The guardian answered on the third ring. Their voice was polite but slightly hurried, with a hint of something else underneath, a defensiveness that seemed to surface before she'd even explained why she was calling. Ms. Elena began describing the drawings, focusing on the positive aspects first, before mentioning the evolving patterns she'd noticed. The recurring darkened window, the fractured figures, the way the colors had begun to feel less joyful and more desperate. She kept her tone light, professional, framing it as curiosity about the child's creative process. That's when she heard it. A faint sound in the background, barely audible but unmistakable. A child's voice, muffled but desperate. A single word whispered like a plea. "Help!" Then silence, as if a hand had been placed over a mouth. The guardian's response came too quickly, too smoothly. They dismissed the concerns with a practiced explanation about an active imagination and a phase the child was going through. The words were right, but the tone was all wrong. Not concerned, but irritated. Controlled. Miss Elena ended the call with a polite thank you. She set the phone down slowly. The classroom, once warm and familiar, suddenly felt cold. The air itself had changed. That single whispered word echoed in the silence, and she knew nothing about this situation was routine anymore. Her hands were trembling slightly as she reached for the drawings again. She spread them across her desk in chronological order, the progression of weeks laid bare in wax and paper. What had initially looked like creative choices now revealed themselves as patterns of distress. That blackened window wasn't just a window. It was a void, colored in with such pressure that the paper had begun to tear. The fractured figures weren't artistic style. They were carefully drawn breaks across a parent's form, as if the child was trying to show something coming apart. She noticed symbols she'd missed before. Tiny locks drawn on doors. A small bird in a cage that appeared in the corner of 3 different drawings. A sun that had gradually been covered by storm clouds, until in the most recent picture, the sky was completely darkened. The contrast was heartbreaking. Cheerful subjects, a birthday party, a trip to the zoo, a family picnic serving as camouflage for this underlying language of fear. The bright colors felt less like joy and more like a desperate attempt to hide the truth in plain sight. She understood now. This wasn't just artwork. This was a lexicon of unspoken fear, a dictionary of distress, created by a child who had no other words. Each drawing was a page in a story the child couldn't speak aloud. The weight of that realization settled on her shoulders, heavy and cold. She was holding a cry for help, made with crayons, and she could no longer unsee what had been shown to her. The guardian's words played back in her mind with perfect, terrible clarity. "Oh, that's just their imagination running wild." The phrase had been delivered with such smooth assurance, like a well-rehearsed line. They've always been dramatic with their art, but it was the tone that chilled her more than the words. Not the tone of a concerned caregiver puzzled by a child's behavior, but the tone of someone who had expected this call. The irritation had been carefully controlled, but it was there, a sharp edge beneath the polite delivery. She remembered the faint sounds during the call, too. That muffled whisper of help was only the beginning. There had been a soft, shuffling noise immediately afterward, like someone moving quickly. Then a door closing. Then, complete silence on that end of the line, as if the child had been removed from the situation entirely. The explanation had been too simple, too neat. It didn't account for the consistency of the patterns across weeks of drawings. It didn't explain the evolution from happy scenes to these desperate images. Most of all, it completely ignored the terrified whisper she'd heard so clearly. Now, in the quiet of her classroom, that silent plea echoed in her mind. It grew clearer with each repetition, more desperate, more real. It wasn't just her imagination. It was a child's voice, reaching through the phone, through the drawings, through every barrier that had been placed around them. And she had heard it. The whisper wasn't a word any longer. It was a presence in the room with her. Not just help, but the gasp that came before it, the sudden cutoff, the sound of movement that followed. Her professional training, usually a quiet background hum, clicked into place with startling clarity. This wasn't just a child being dramatic. This was controlled communication. The muffling, the immediate silence afterward, these were signs of suppression, of someone who wasn't free to speak. A visceral shiver ran through her, completely unrelated to the temperature of the classroom. Her skin prickled with the understanding that she had just heard something she wasn't supposed to hear. That a child had risked something to send that single syllable through the phone line. In that breathless moment, her entire focus shifted. She was no longer just an educator reviewing artwork. She had become a witness. And with that came the immediate, weighty role of protector. Her mind began racing backward through the school year, sifting through memories now viewed through this terrifying new lens. The child's quietness in class. She'd noted it as shyness, a personality trait. The fatigue that sometimes showed in drooping eyelids during morning lessons. She'd assumed late nights or trouble sleeping. The withdrawn posture, how they seemed to fold into themselves when other children got too loud or moved too quickly. Small details emerged with new significance. The uniform that was always perfectly neat, as if maintaining appearances was critically important. The way the child subtly avoided touch, flinching slightly when a hand came too near, always finding reasons to step back. They had perfected a kind of invisibility, staying just outside the center of attention, never causing trouble, never drawing extra notice. She remembered a moment last month when the child had dropped a water bottle, and instead of the expected surprise or frustration, there had been a flash of pure panic in their eyes before they quickly composed themselves. At the time, she'd thought it was an overreaction to a simple mistake. Now she saw it differently. The guilt arrived like a physical weight. How many signs had she missed? How many small moments of quiet suffering had she witnessed without understanding what she was seeing? She began piecing together a timeline in her mind. The first darkened window in the drawings coincided with when the child started wearing long sleeves, even on warm days. The fractured figures began appearing after a 3-day absence for a family emergency. Each memory clicked into place like a piece of a terrible puzzle she wished she couldn't see. The pattern had been there all along, woven into the ordinary fabric of school days. waiting for someone to look closely enough to read it. Ms. Elena sat completely still. The drawings spread before her like evidence in a case she never asked to join. Her classroom, usually a place of learning and safety, now felt like a chamber where a terrible decision had to be made. The ethical duty she felt wasn't confined to teaching fractions and reading comprehension. It extended beyond these walls, into a home where a child might be in danger. There was a conflict raging inside her, professional protocol wrestling with moral imperative. The training manuals talked about documentation, about chain of command, about not jumping to conclusions. But her gut, that deep teacher's instinct honed over years of watching children, told her this couldn't wait for perfect procedures. The fear of being wrong, of misreading the situation and upending an innocent family's life, was real and terrifying. But it was dwarfed by the greater fear, the fear of being right about what those drawings meant and doing nothing. She thought about the potential consequences. Making that call could change everything. For the child, for the guardian, for her own career if she had misjudged the situation. But the alternative, staying silent because the evidence wasn't neat and tidy, because she might be wrong, that wasn't an option she could live with. The paralyzing shock began to recede, replaced by a quiet, steady resolve. She would rather err on the side of a child's safety than risk being another adult who looked away. Her hand was surprisingly steady as she picked up the phone again. This time she dialed the confidential helpline number she'd been given during her mandatory reporter training, the one she never thought she'd actually use. The phone rang twice before a calm, professional voice answered. She started with the facts, just as she'd been trained. She described the artwork patterns, the consistent darkening, the fracturing, the evolution over time. She mentioned the phone call, sticking to what she'd observed, the guardian's defensive tone, the too smooth explanations, the concerning sounds in the background. She was careful not to speculate, not to fill in gaps with assumptions. Just the facts, laid out as clearly as she could manage. The wait for guidance felt agonizing. Every minute stretched into what felt like an hour, the silence in the classroom amplifying the pounding of her own heart. The woman on the other end was methodical, asking clarifying questions in that same calm tone. Ms. Elena understood this was necessary. They had to build the picture properly, step by step, to ensure the right response. She learned about the process that would follow, how her report would be evaluated by experts who knew how to assess these situations, how if they determined there was reasonable cause for concern, trained professionals would make contact, people who knew how to ask the right questions, how to look for the signs she might have missed, how to ensure the child's safety while gathering information. This wasn't about rushing in. It was about building a proper response with people who knew how to navigate these delicate, dangerous situations. She wasn't alone in this anymore. She had become part of a system designed to protect, and that knowledge brought its own kind of relief. The moment the formal process began, everything changed. Ms. Elena watched from her classroom window as two professionals from Child Services arrived at the school, their presence both terrifying and reassuring. They moved with a quiet competence that spoke of experience with situations exactly like this one. They knew how to ask questions that wouldn't frighten a child, how to look for truths hidden behind careful answers. When the child returned to class the next day, the change was almost imperceptible to anyone who hadn't been watching as closely as she had. The same neat uniform, the same quiet demeanor. But the posture was different, just a fraction less tense. The shoulders not quite so hunched toward the ears. The child moved through the classroom routines with the same practiced invisibility, but something in the eyes had shifted. Then it happened during a quiet reading period. The child looked up from their book, and for the first time, their eyes met Miss Elena's directly. Not the quick, guarded glances she was accustomed to, but a full, unguarded look that lasted for 3 full seconds. In that look she saw everything. Fear, yes, but also something new. Something that looked like recognition. Like the understanding that an adult had finally seen what they'd been trying to show, and had done something about it. The road ahead would be long and difficult, she knew that. Healing never happens overnight. But now there was a team involved, social workers, counselors, people who knew how to help a child rebuild trust and safety. The child was no longer whispering into a void, hoping someone would hear. They had allies now. The profound truth settled over her in that moment. The most important things children tell us are often said without words. They're hidden in the pressure of a crayon on paper, in the subtle shift of body language, in the spaces between what is said and what is felt. The line between normalcy and silent crisis is terrifyingly fragile, but so is the power of simply paying attention, of looking closely enough to see the truth hidden in plain sight, and having the courage to act on what you find.